Thank you. I've always wanted to preach under a tree. Big shoes to fill. Well, we've heard a number of quotes from the Bible, and I'm going to read a passage from one of the NDP's holy books, which is Graham Truelove's biography of Sven Robinson. But it was the case of a 22-year-old Chilean refugee named Galindo Madrid that provided the most lasting impression of the rookie MP during the Clark administration. Late to return from shore leave from a freighter Star Pride, Madrid was confined to quarters and told by the captain that he'd be returned to Chile at the nearest opportunity. Madrid was scared. As a student leader in Chile, he'd been vocal in his criticism of dictator Augusto Pinochet and had fled the country on a black market passport. Return could mean torture, imprisonment, or worse. The Longshoremen's Union in Squamish, BC, where the Star Pride was docked, heard of the young Chilean trapped on board and refused to unload the freighter's cargo until Madrid was allowed ashore. The captain had no choice but to comply with the union's demand. Madrid came ashore and immediately went to the RCMP to ask for asylum. As Madrid's case meandered unsuccessfully through various immigration courts and appeal boards, he worked as a dishwasher in Vancouver and looked for friends in the Chilean-Canadian community. He found many. Joining forces with churches and labor groups, Madrid's allies formed the Galindo Madrid Defense Committee and set about making the case to the Canadian public that Madrid should be allowed to stay. Madrid's chilling stories of his time in the Chilean army and of the mass executions of dissidents ordered by Pinochet captured the media's attention. His condemnations of the Pinochet regime were scathing. If Madrid wasn't a legitimate refugee before, he was now. While Chile issued him a new passport, it bore the dreaded L, the mark of an undesirable person. On July 23, 1979, Robinson received word that the RCMP were looking for Madrid, about to enact the long-standing deportation order against him. Immigration Minister Ron Atke had previously delayed the order due to the public outcry that Madrid's story had generated, but now the fatal moment was just hours away. Robinson took a gamble. Inviting Madrid to his home in the Norman Bethune Housing Co-op in Burnaby, he called a press conference and announced that he was offering his home as a sanctuary to Madrid until Atke agreed to let him stay in Canada. I don't think the RCMP are going to break down my door, he told the assembled media. I'm sure the government is well aware of the political implications of violating the sanctity of a member of Parliament's house. The dramatic gesture of an MP taking the law into his own hands was front-page news the next day. Of course, Robinson had no authority to grant legal sanctuary to anyone. It had been hundreds of years since even churches had that authority. However, he hoped that his action would continue to a groundswell of support from the public that might convince the government to at least postpone the deportation again. It was all symbols. So much of it was symbolism, he explains. It told the public what was happening with this guy, and that helped generate support. The public was largely on side. Robinson and Madrid flew to Ottawa and sat outside Atke's office until he agreed to meet with them. Meanwhile, the Galindo Madrid Defense Committee kept pushing. Atke's office was deluged with letters and telegrams. Supportive editorials appeared in major newspapers. Robinson raised Madrid's case in the House. Finally, Atke had had enough. The minister issued a special permit allowing him to stay. So, Mikhail, if they get tired of you here, come on over to my house. Now, we've already heard a little bit about the legal status of the practice of sanctuary, and as a legislator, I've been listening very carefully, and I'm also a lawyer. And we know that it's nowhere clearly defined in Canadian law. I actually think sanctuary is a matter of politics, ethics, civics, morality, spirituality, and love. Listening here, it has inspired me that our society is made up of many powers that are acting together in society. We're seeing the power of the church. We're seeing the power of the state. We're seeing the power of people. We're seeing how these powers interact together and push and jostle as they struggle to sort out these difficult situations. It reminds me, though, that of the famous phrase that the law sometimes is an ass. And it reminds me of our duty as citizens to resist unjust laws or unjust situations. It reminds me of the civil disobedience that we all remember from the 1950s when people rose up and resisted unjust laws, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus. It reminds me of what's going on today on the mountain in Burnaby, where people are resisting what they consider to be an unjust assault on our climate. This concept of social license is almost the modern day application of what we call civil disobedience. It's the idea of doing something that resonates with people, and when people stand up to the state and say, this just doesn't seem right. So I think the concept of sanctuary is really an issue of justice. People who seek sanctuary invariably do so as a last resort when the state has been unable or unwilling to render justice in a case of persecution. This is not surprising. Our immigration and refugee determination system suffers from a number of flaws that make unjust decisions not only possible, but indeed not uncommon. I joke with people that I don't have a constituency office, I have an immigration law practice. I'll give you, this has been covered a little bit, but I want you to understand a little bit about the immigration system. McKill's pointed out, our lawyer has eminently pointed out, there is usually only one hearing that you get when you apply for status in Canada on the merits. One hearing. The appeals that you get thereafter are limited to questions of procedure. If there's an initial incorrect decision made, as I believe has been made in all three of these cases you've heard tonight, you can't correct it. In fact, our administrative law is so perverse that there's jurisprudence that says that even incorrect decisions can't be overturned, as long as they were procedurally solid. Often there's only one person sitting in adjudication. Adjudicators are often appointed on partisan, often political grounds. I remember reading the case of one adjudicator who heard 140 straight cases of refugee applications and turned every single one of them down. Recent legislative amendments have deepened the problems by speeding up the process and imposing unrealistic timelines, often requiring quick hearings on refugee cases when the claimant is unprepared to proceed, traumatized, isolated, or underrepresented, without documents, etc. These are the real-life situations upon which that critical, pivotal, profound initial decision is made. Now here, I think we have heard enough tonight to see the perversity that I have come to believe exists in these three cases and others across the country. We have three men and their families who are supported, in fact loved by their communities. In Jose's case, I think he's been here going on 20 years. Mikhail, absolutely loved and respected in his community of Burnaby. And of course, we've got the case of Rodney in East Vancouver, who I just think is a model of courage. There has not been a shred of evidence presented at any time by the state that they have done anything wrong. In fact, all the evidence shows that these people are fine, upstanding, superb members of our country. I say these are exactly the kind of people that Canada should be welcoming into our country. And you know, it's interesting. I think the only thing I've ever agreed with Ronald Reagan on is when he said that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Now, when I listen to the stories, if you actually listen to the stories upon which the government bases its claim that these people are inadmissible, it's really for doing no more than exercising their freedom of association. So what if Jose Figueroa was a member of the FMLN? So what if Mikhail Lenikov worked for the KGB? In the case of Rodney Watson, so what if he exercised his freedom of conscience and decided that he'd rather put down his gun? These are rights in our country, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, that I believe are fundamental rights of being a Canadian citizen. Now, I want to talk just a bit about politics because it comes down to this. You know, I believe that the decisions against these three people are inherently political. I have talked to Jason Kenney. I have talked to Chris Alexander. And I can tell you that they are not listening in any way to any of the logic or the jurisprudence or the justice of these situations. NDP policy 4.1 in our policy book under human rights and peace says this: New Democrats believe in using all diplomatic and political means to protect human rights and help those facing persecution, including refugees, women, minorities, and victims of acts of genocide. On December 6, 2007, Olivia Chow, our then immigration critic, moved the following motion at the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration: that the government immediately implement a program to allow conscientious objectors and their immediate family members who have refused or left military service related to a war not sanctioned by the UN and who do not have a criminal record to apply for permanent residence and remain in Canada, and that the government should immediately cease any removal or deportation actions that have already commenced against such individuals. That motion passed. On June 4, 2008, Olivia Chow moved that same motion in the House of Commons. It was adopted 137 to 110. Now, that was in a minority parliament. The NDP has consistently called for the Government of Canada to act in accordance with those motions, which have never been countermanded, and the current government has refused to respect the democratic will of the House of Commons. Really, I think sanctuary boils down to an issue of conscience, of justice, and of politics. Canada, the Canada that I grew up in the 60s and 1970s, and still forms the core inside my soul, the Canada that I'm proud of, and that I think most Canadians are proud of, was a country in the 1960s and 1970s that welcomed U.S. draft dodgers who poured across our border rather than fight in an unjust war. And at that time, they didn't have to seek sanctuary. We gave them permanent residence cards virtually immediately. That's, I think, what a modern, just country does. It's the kind of country that I think we need to get back to. I support those who have the courage and conscience to protect people from injustice and persecution when the law cannot or will not. I support a Canada where conscientious objectors, those who choose not to participate in war, have a welcome and safe home. Like Bill Clinton said on abortion, he said that he wanted a policy where it was accessible, safe, and rare. I think those are wise words in terms of sanctuary, where it should be accessible, safe, and rare. At the end of the day, I just want to thank the pastors, the clergy, the congregations, the public, and Mikhail, Jose, and Rodney, and most importantly, their families, for your courage, compassion, commitment, and grace. There will be justice for you in 2015, I hope. Thank you.